My grandmother always said trust was the most valuable currency in the world. She said it while sitting in her small kitchen in 2015, holding a cup of tea that trembled slightly in her hands because she was nervous about meeting with her new financial advisor. I was there that day. I watched her put on her business meeting outfit, a navy blazer she'd owned for 15 years, and I thought about how much courage it took for her to hand over her life's work to a stranger. Her name was Margaret. She wasn't flashy or demanding. She was quiet, methodical, professional, the kind of woman who made you feel safe immediately. She had an office in the business district, leather chairs, motivational quotes on the walls, framed certifications that I never thought to verify. She smiled warmly at my grandmother and said things like, "I specialize in retirement planning for women your age. You're my favorite demographic because you actually understand the value of money." My grandmother was 73 years old. She had worked for 50 years, first as a nurse, then as a nurse supervisor, then as a consultant. She'd invested carefully, lived below her means, never spent recklessly. She had $847,000 in various accounts, retirement funds, and savings. It was the result of a lifetime of discipline, sacrifice, and postponed dreams. She wanted to spend her final years comfortably, help her grandchildren, maybe travel to places she'd only read about. Margaret promised all of that would be possible, better than possible. She said Margaret specialized in turning conservative portfolios into growth vehicles. She used words like market opportunities and untapped potential. She said her grandmother's money was sleeping and she could wake it up. I remember my grandmother's face during that first meeting. It was hopeful. It was the face of someone who had worked so hard that she finally felt permitted to dream a little. That was the last time I saw her look truly at peace. For the first 6 months, Margaret sent detailed statements, beautiful documents with charts and graphs showing steady growth, modest but consistent returns. My grandmother would call me excited, saying things like, "The advisor said we're beating the market average." She felt smart. She felt secure. She felt like someone had finally acknowledged the weight of what she'd built and would honor it. That was the trap. By month 7, the communications became less frequent. Margaret's office was moving to a new location. She'd be in and out for a while. When my grandmother called, Margaret was always just stepping into a meeting or leaving town. But the statements kept coming, still positive, still growing. My grandmother stopped worrying. I should have wondered why I never met Margaret again. I should have asked to see the actual investment accounts. I should have done 100 things differently. But I was 35 years old, building my own career, trusting that my grandmother was being taken care of by someone professional and credentialed. That's what predators count on. They count on your trust in the system itself. They count on the assumption that someone wouldn't lie, that licensing meant something, that fraud was rare enough to not worry about. It wasn't. 2 years into the arrangement, my grandmother called me on a Tuesday morning and said she needed help understanding something. Her voice sounded strange, thinner somehow, like she was conserving energy. We sat in her living room and she showed me a letter from the bank informing her that her monthly transfer requests couldn't be processed because there were insufficient funds in her investment accounts. I felt something cold move through my chest. We called Margaret's office. The phone number had been disconnected. We drove to the business address. The office was empty, completely empty. New tenants had moved in 2 months prior. Nobody knew where Margaret had gone. My grandmother's hands started shaking. She said, "That's not possible. I saw the statements. The money was growing." We pulled her statements from her files, beautiful documents, professional layouts, convincing numbers. I called the investments firms listed on the letterhead. They had no record of any accounts under Margaret's name or my grandmother's name. The certifications in Margaret's office photos, I looked them up. One was from a diploma mill, one was fabricated, one was real but obtained 15 years ago and never updated or verified. That was the moment everything inside me broke. I contacted the police. They took a report and explained, very gently, that this was civil fraud, not criminal fraud, and the burden of proof was on us. We needed bank records, wire transfers, documentation of promises made. Margaret had apparently been very careful to do everything verbally. The statements were professional looking, but not from any legitimate source. There was no contract with specific return promises. Everything was assumed or promised, but never written down. We hired a lawyer. He looked at the documents, shook his head slowly, and said, "She's gone. Disappeared. Probably liquidated everything and moved to another state or another country. Cases like this, the perpetrator is rarely found, and even if she is, she likely has nothing left to recover. It's legally complicated and emotionally devastating." He quoted us $15,000 for what he said would be a long investigation with probably no resolution. My grandmother couldn't afford that. She had just discovered that she had $62,000 left. The rest, $785,000, was simply gone. I watched my grandmother age a decade in a week. I watched her go from hopeful to broken. I watched her start looking for jobs for 73-year-olds. I watched her pretend to be fine at family dinners while calculating how long she could survive on her remaining savings and Social Security. The worst part was the shame. My grandmother felt ashamed. She kept saying, "I should have known better. I was stupid to trust her." It was her voice saying it, but it was really the voice of every person who ever lied to her, every system that failed her, every person who took advantage of her goodness. Most people would have tried to move on. Most people would have accepted that this was a lesson learned. My grandmother was not most people, and neither am I. I started investigating. I became obsessed. Methodically, carefully, I started pulling threads. I created a false profile online as a potential client looking for financial advice. I started reaching out to financial planning offices in our state. I described Margaret's appearance from my grandmother's description. I asked about advisors who specialized in elderly portfolios. Nothing came up initially, but then I started expanding my search. Different states, online forums where people discuss financial fraud, Reddit threads about investment scams, and slowly a pattern emerged. There were other victims, at least 17 that I could find through public records and online complaints. Different names, Margaret must have used aliases, but the same playbook: professional office, certification photos, detailed statements, promises of growth, then disappearance, then empty accounts. Some were in their 80s. One had lost $1.2 million. They'd all reported the crimes. None had recovered anything. I hired a private investigator. It took 3 months and cost $4,000, money my grandmother gave me, tears streaming down her face because she wanted to know. The investigator found her. Her real name was Margaret Castellano. She was 51 years old. She had 3 prior convictions for fraud in different states. She'd been arrested in 2007 for a similar scheme targeting seniors. She'd served 2 years and been released early on good behavior. She had a daughter and a son. She'd been using aliases including Margaret Chase, Margaret Sterling, and Margaret Wells. But here's what really made my hands shake. She was living in a luxury apartment in Miami. She was driving a Range Rover. She had $2.3 million in bank accounts under various names. She was living openly, visibly, doing exactly what she'd done before, but smarter. The investigator handed me her current address, her employment records — she was working under fake credentials with a legitimate financial firm — and her daily patterns. She went to Pilates on Tuesday mornings. She got coffee at the same cafe every morning at 7:15. She was, in every visible way, living the life that she'd stolen from my grandmother. I sat in my car in that Miami parking garage for 4 hours, watching her walk past, designer sunglasses on, laughing on her phone. I felt something I'd never felt before, a rage so pure and focused that it felt almost religious. This woman had taken my grandmother's security, she had taken her peace, she had taken her dignity, and she was walking free. I could have turned her into the authorities, but I'd already learned that the authorities didn't care. The system was broken. The penalties were minimal. She'd probably serve another 2 years and walk free again, moving to another state, finding new elderly victims. So I became something different. I became patient. I spent the next 6 months building a case, not for the police, for the public. I started reaching out to the other victims I'd found online. I located their contact information. I called them. I listened to their stories. An 89-year-old woman who lost her retirement after her husband died and couldn't afford her medications anymore. An 82-year-old man whose children had to move him into assisted living because he could no longer afford his home. A widow who'd been robbed of her husband's legacy. I recorded their testimonies with their permission. I gathered documentation. I created a detailed timeline showing Margaret's pattern across 15 years and 6 states. I compiled a dossier that was more thorough than any police investigation. And then I contacted a journalist.